Thanks very much for having me. It's my pleasure to talk to you today about some of the work that I've mostly done during my PhD, as Marcel just said, with Tobias Donner in Hamburg, where when I started that research, I was very interested in the process of perceptual decision-making, which is still my interest. So the main question here is, how do we take sensory information, mostly visual information in my particular focus of study, from the world and interpret what we see in that information? And now very often this is a difficult problem. For instance, in the image here, you may doubt whether this is a friendly neighborhood cat or whether it may be a more dangerous tiger, in which case the outcome of your internal decision might have a large impact on your subsequent behavior, for instance, whether to approach or to run away from this animal. And as you can see in this example, the difficulty of this decision mostly comes because the sensory information is kind of low quality. In this case, there's a kind of noisiness to this image. So I started out, this was back in 2013, wanting to study this process. And in the lab, as you may have heard about, this is very often studied with kind of classical visual stimuli that can be very well controlled, and where we can degrade certain types of sensory information to make these types of choices more difficult, and then really probe how does the brain solve this perceptual uncertainty. So here's an example of stimuli that I would show the participants that came to my experiments. It depends a little bit on how good the video connection is, but I hope that you can see that there's these flickering dots on the screen. They look a bit like snowflakes, and that a few times in this movie, you see them moving in a certain direction. So people had to answer what direction the dots were moving in. So just I'm curious, I see a few faces. Could you indicate, like with your hand, maybe point to where you think the dots are going so I can test your perceptual sensitivity? I see some waves. Yeah, quite good. Okay, and now can you do a 0 to 5 of how confident you are? 0 is like no idea, and 5 is like completely sure. 3, 2, 5. Okay, quite varying. It will depend on like a video conference. This is a little bit more tricky. Of course, it will depend a bit on your computer and whatnot. But so to me, the dots move towards the bottom right. So let's say I don't know, 4 o'clock, and they move quite strongly. Now, of course, in the lab, I don't just want to ask people this once, but I would have people do these types of decisions over and over again, you know, maybe for an hour or so. So it gets a bit boring. And to study then this process by which sensory information is transformed into a decision, I would also, as shown here, vary the type of information that I would present. So for example, the dots could move either upwards or downwards, but I would also vary the strength. So at the very top of this graph here, you see very strongly moving stimuli going upwards, whereas at the midline, there would be just flicker. Now, there are a lot of existing frameworks like signal detection theory and the diffusion model that I'll talk about later, which describe this kind of perceptual inference process. But what's really important is that they make a core assumption, which is that each time we make a decision, it's independent of the sequence in which it's embedded. So that these tasks really isolate only the perception. And when I was doing these types of tasks and looking at the data, it turned out that this was really not the case for many participants. So this is illustrated here by an example sequence. These are real responses from someone doing the task, where you can see that rather than kind of each time assessing the sensory information and making their decision just based on that, this person is highly repetitive in their behavior. So there's like responses up, 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 and then at some point there's a switch and they would go down. So this phenomenon has been described in the literature for quite a long time, almost a century, in fact, and it's been going by a few different names, but I'm gonna call it choice history bias. So it's the dependence of the choices that we make, not just on the sensory evidence, but also on the history of preceding choices. And importantly, in this case, people knew that their previous choices weren't relevant for the decision at hand. So there wasn't any kind of explicit information that should guide their decisions. So the existence of this phenomenon has also been described, perhaps a little bit dramatically, as psychophysics is based on a lie. Like there's a kind of core assumption in a lot of these models that doesn't hold, and that I think is interesting to study for quite a number of reasons that I'll come back to. So what do we know about these types of biases very briefly? So we know that they arise most strongly from the previous choices that we make, not the stimuli that were presented or the motor response, let's say the finger that you use to press the left or the right button on the keyboard, but the interpretation of the sensory evidence. We know that their strength depends on the confidence in a certain decision that you make, and that they reflect this process of information integration across many trials. And usually it's something like between 5 and 3 trials into the past that influence these biases. And even more broadly, we think that these types of biases arise because people come into the lab with an expectation that the sequence of the world or the statistics of the world have a certain property. They have this, what you can call a subjective hazard rate. They expect perhaps that stimuli repeat, and they bring this expectation with them to the lab. And if it doesn't match the task structure, we see these types of biases emerge. And these biases point to a kind of interesting source of variability in choices that could be unappreciated if you simply ignore this sequential effect. So they kind of tap into a source of noise that isn't really noise in the decision process, but that we can pinpoint here. And I think, and I'll show you later, that they reveal some interesting properties about kind of the neural mechanisms underlying these types of perceptual decisions. So the question that I'll answer today is, how does this choice history affect the dynamics of decision processes? And here I'm going to come back to the promise of the title of my talk, which included drift diffusion models. Could I have a quick show of hands before I dive in of how many people know what drift diffusion models are? Maybe if you know them really well, give me like a 5, 0 if you've never heard of it, and a 1 if you've just heard it mentioned. 4, 3, 1, 1, 5. Okay, so it's quite varied. Most people have at least heard of it, which is good, but have perhaps not spent a lot of time with these models. So I'll quickly introduce them. So the idea here is, how do we arrive at a decision about this noisy sensory information? So because the information is noisy, we have to integrate over time, and the sensory evidence that hits our eye has to be integrated into what we call a decision variable. So this is the quantity that describes. How's that? Are we back?
Yeah, perfect.
I'm sorry. I hope this is good. I'm switching internet a few times. Where was I? Right. So to form these decisions, we accumulate sensory information, and the angle or the direction of this accumulation is described by a parameter that we call V, or the drift rate. So this drift rate is a word you may have heard, and it kind of describes the strength of evidence towards one or the other option. The two options are then indicated by a bound that are here shown as A and 0. The terminology doesn't matter too much, but what happens in this model is that once this integrated gray decision variable hits a bound, it triggers a decision towards clicking, let's say, the button that corresponds to upwards motion, for example. And what's then really nice about this model is that we get not only these responses, but also the reaction times. So the time it takes to complete this accumulation process, and these reaction time distributions are shown at the top and the bottom, can help us fit this model and retrieve the underlying parameters that give rise to this decision process. So this model has been very popular in neurophysiology to kind of map and tease apart the different stages of evidence integration in the brain. And what I wanted to do is take this framework and see how can we explain the existence of these choice history biases that we see in perception. So if you think about biasing a choice towards a certain direction, let's say repeating the choice for up, if you've just said up before, then there's 2 ways to do it. The first is perhaps the most intuitive, and it is to shift the starting point, which in this model is encoded by the variable Z, in the direction of the choice that you're going to repeat. So in this case, it simply shifts up, which means that before you have seen any evidence, your tendency is already towards responding up again, and then you just accumulate as normal. Now, for those of you that like equations, here's a differential equation to just show where this bias enters into the decision process. So we have if you see my cursor, you can see the beginning of the integration process is biased by adding this z-bias term, but the evidence integration itself only depends on the sensory evidence and the drift rate over time, plus some noise. If you're not into equations, totally fine, just look at the graphs. Now, importantly, there's another way in which we can bias the decision process towards, let's say, repeating the choice, which has quite different implications for the neural mechanisms that might create this bias. So here, the starting point is unaffected, as you see, but as we integrate sensory information, we integrate a little bit of choice bias along the way. So at each step of the integration, we become a little bit more biased, and that is shown here. Now, importantly, teasing apart these two scenarios gives very different predictions for kind of the neural processes that may give rise to them. So a starting point shift is more likely to arise from an effective motor preparation, so something that really sits apart from the evidence integration itself, whereas a change in the drift bias through choice history is more likely to arise from a change in sensory encoding or its readout or integration. So I wanted to test this question using a number of different data sets, all perceptual decision making. I'm not going to go through the details. You can look it up in this paper if you want, but there were 6 ones of them. They had visual, auditory data sets. Some had feedback, some didn't have feedback, all different types of stimuli that I combined so that I had a nice big data set of almost 200 observers. Now, what we then observed is that individual people show these choice history biases, which are here shown as simply the tendency to repeat one choice after the other. And we can see that each individual or many individuals have a pretty strong bias either towards repeating or alternating, but that across the group, this can actually average out. So the group as a whole is really heterogeneous. And this means that if you simply only look at the group average and not at these individual differences, you can easily miss an effect like this, which I think is another lesson that it can be super helpful to look into individual observers in your data sets. And we saw this heterogeneity across these 6 different data sets. I then could fit these 2 models, as I said, using this diffusion model framework to all the data. And first, we then performed a model comparison to very simply see which of the models best explained data. And here, lower is better. So you'll see a bar here in green for a model with only a starting point shift, depending on the previous choice, or a drift bias shift, or both. And we see that across all these data sets, most of them had the winning model that had both data sets, actually. So we need both these parameters to fully account for these choice history effects on decision making, but the drift bias term was kind of winning in most of the data sets. Now, as I said, there was a big effect of kind of individuality in these history biases. So what I then wanted to do is for each observer, I can quantify how much people repeat or alternate their behaviors. So that's shown here on the right. And to see how well this individual behavior is captured by the parameters of shifting your starting point here on the left in green, or shifting your drift bias, depending on choice history. And for the starting point shift, I somewhat surprisingly found no correlation between the two. However, I found that these individual history biases in behavior are really strongly captured by this history shift in the drift bias, so in the way that people accumulate evidence for their new choice. And again, what was nice about using all these different data sets is that we could be really certain that this didn't depend on one specific task, for instance. I'm going to skip this. So we did a number of other modeling exercises to kind of pinpoint how basically the previous choice that we make can give rise to this moment-to-moment bias that feeds into the evidence accumulation and leading, as I said, to these kind of idiosyncratic choice history biases. Now, this is published. I invite you.
Yeah, just let's wait for another few minutes. I'm sure she will be back soon.
Sorry?
Oh, okay, now it was my internet connection, sorry. Sorry, just go on.
Is everyone there?
Yeah.
I still see some faces.
We can all hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. This is the downside of the virtual meetings, of course. Right. So I'll show some unpublished data next, where we try to kind of zoom in and pinpoint if we could find these kind of signatures of these biases in the brain. I see a raised hand. I don't know if that is a question. I'm happy to take questions now, or that was still one of the 5 that someone did. David, do you have a question? Or no question. Okay. Anyone else have a question? Feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or just speak up. If not, we can discuss at the end. Okay. Good. So that was a bit of a very quick overview of this kind of modeling exercise, which I think is a really nice way to kind of identify these components of the decision process that you think may be the computationally relevant kind of core components of this process of interest. And what's also nice is that they kind of naturally map onto some ideas on this type of evidence integration in the brain. So the sensory evidence, for instance, these moving dots, are most strongly represented in visual cortex, at least in primates and in humans. These are then integrated into a decision variable in these frontal and parietal regions. And this decision variable, we know, is also continuously read out in an action plan in motor cortex. So people also prepare their actions kind of while they're still integrating information. So we can make some specific predictions about what types of neural signatures we may find that also underlie these choice history biases. So we designed a task, and this is actually one of the 6 data sets that I previously showed you. So after we analyzed just the behavioral data, but people were sitting in the MEG scanner while they performed this task. And we designed this task specifically so that we could pull out these components of sensory information and motor preparation. So people, again, saw these flickering dots, but they now didn't have to judge their direction, but the strength. So how many of the dots were moving coherently in one direction together. So we first showed them a reference window where 70% of the dots were moving in the same direction, followed by a short delay and then a test where the dots were either moving more strongly or less strongly. So they had to say, was there more coherent motion or a less coherent motion in this test interval? We then gave them some feedback and showed them static dots at the end. And what's nice about this task, I think, is that by making the strength, this visual motion, the relevant quantity, we can very easily track this over visual cortex. This is work from Marcus Siegel and Tobias Donner. Well, this is actually my work, but work from them already showed quite a long time ago that if you just present strongly coherent dot patterns, that people will have an increase in the gamma band response over their visual cortex, which you can measure with MEG or EEG. And that's what we replicated here. So this is simply the time frequency response. So here you see this gamma band response of a strong versus weak motion stimuli over these occipital sensors here in the MEG. We also see a decrease in kind of lower frequency alpha band responses. So this gives us this nice kind of single trial metric for the amount of sensory information that people should use to then make their decision. What we can then also do is use a beamformer, so combining these MEG data with individual MRIs and really then focusing on the signals that come from these areas that we know are retinotopically organized and have these visual responses. So in this case, this is B3A and B, which is known in the human brain to be involved in motion processing, and you see very similar things across visual cortex. So specifically, when we show this first interval here, there's an overall response, but it's always 70%, so there's no distinction. But in the second test interval, when we show strong motion, we see a much higher gamma band response than when we show weaker motion. So that's all a good sanity check. Now, we can then repeat this exercise, not just for V3A and B, but across interesting regions of interest that we know are involved in visual motion processing and decision-making, such as MT, but also all these different visual field maps along the parietal cortex here, the interparietal sulcus, as well as several areas like the M1 motor region, premotor cortex, and anterior IPS. Now, again, as a sanity check, we can kind of show these along the hierarchy of how we think the information is kind of traveling. So going from V1 kind of up the parietal cortex and ending in motor cortex. Here we see that the effect of visual stimuli indeed is most strong here early on in the visual cortex. All good. But what was then really interesting to us is that we can test not just the effect of the current stimuli, but also on the choice that people made just before, because we know that people have these biases that depend on their previous choices. And there we saw quite a different effect, namely that specifically in the kind of higher regions of the interparietal sulcus. So in this case, these regions are called IPS 2 and 3. So they sit kind of here at the top of this retinotopically organized parietal gradient. We see that the gamma band responses are stronger when on the previous trial, people have chosen that they saw stronger motion versus that the previous trial had a decision that was towards weaker motion. So there seems to be this boost in gamma band responses in this parietal region in the direction of people's previous choice, which we thought was a really neat and kind of interesting potential source for driving these accumulation biases that we see with the drift diffusion model. What was then also really interesting to us is that we know that there's these strong individual differences. And so we tested again whether these individual differences between people also could be found in this parietal gamma band signature. And that was indeed the case. So we see that people that repeat their choice one after the other have a much stronger effect in this of the dependence of this gamma band signal on their previous choices than people who alternated their responses. And lastly, we can look at the time course of the signature. So here you see simply the effect of these previous choices on gamma band responses in IPS. And this is a very sustained signature. So we see that kind of carrying over from the previous trial, there's this boost in parietal activity, which is kind of remaining well into the next trial. So that was kind of one signature of these previous choices that we found in parietal cortex. But we also had the ability to look at the kind of other side of this integration process at the motor end. And here we asked people to respond their choice by either pressing the left or the right button. Here again, you can see the trial sequence. And that allowed us to look at the lateralization between motor cortex, which will differ if you press the right button, then there will be more beta band desynchronization over your left motor cortex versus your right. So you see these kind of asymmetries that track the motor preparation of the subject. So if you look here, this is kind of looking at the top of the head from someone, you see that there's these opposite signs of these motor synchronization signals over left and right motor cortex, which is sitting here right at the top. And this is already present before people press the button. But interestingly, after releasing the button, we see these, what it has been called in the literature, a motor rebound. So there's a kind of inversion of this sign. And crucially, this is very, very long lasting. So these motor signatures that kind of follow the release of the button actually carry on well into the next trial. And that's, you can see this here. So this is kind of the trial afterwards, where you have this remaining beta band rebound. And other people have previously suggested that these types of motor signatures actually cause people to alternate, so that there's a kind of inhibition of your motor state because you have this rebound signal, which prevents you from making the same button, pressing the same button again. So Here we can again kind of do the same exercise and map this signal all along this hierarchy. And we see that there is this effect of previous actions in quite a few regions in the motor system. So M1, but also anterior IPS and these premotor regions. So kind of all these ROIs that are shown here. Now we kind of get
sorry,
to,
just
yes?
quickly want to chip in like around 5 more minutes.
Perfect. I think that's great. Now we actually get to kind of the crux. So five minutes is good. So we now have these kind of two candidate signatures that could both in their own way give rise to these choice history biases. We know that they both depend on the history of the choice before. In one case, in the kind of decision space, and in one case in the motor regions. So we hypothesized that we could map those to these different biases as we can identify them in the drift diffusion model. So in particular, this shift in starting point most naturally maps onto an effect in the motor system. So in that case, it doesn't interact with the evidence integration process itself. It's kind of an additive effect. And that would point in direction of alternation, because we know that these beta rebound signals actually, the motor system kind of goes away from the same action, whereas these drift bias signals could be kind of arising through this parietal signal that goes in the direction of repetition, where we see that these gamma band responses are actually boosted in the same direction as people's previous choice. So we used a version of fitting this drift diffusion model, which is a really nice package that some people wrote, where you can add kind of single trial neural predictors and see if they explain some of the variance of the trial by trial fluctuations in these parameters. So first we built a model where we added single trial predictors of this parietal gamma band signal. And we found that it didn't significantly predict starting point, but it had a positive effect on trial by trial fluctuations in this evidence accumulation bias. The motor lateralization, on the other hand, affected negatively the starting point in the direction of choice alternation, but didn't interact with the drift bias. So this gave us a really nice way to kind of tease apart these two distinct sources. On the one hand, we have these parietal kind of repetitive effects that drive people to be sticky in their choices. But on the other hand, we have this kind of slightly weaker starting point effect, which is more at the motor end, which inhibits people from making the same movement once again. And we think that the degree to which individuals ultimately show repetition behavior or alternation behavior is going to depend on the kind of fine-tuning or the balance between these different processes in each individual. And why they have this balance is kind of still a big open question for future work. All right, so to conclude, I think I'm hopefully right on time. We found that gamma band signatures in parietal cortex drive these repetitive biases in evidence accumulation, whereas motor cortex drives starting point biases from trial to trial, which push choices in the direction of alternation. And together, these give rise to these idiosyncratic choice history biases in perceptual decision making. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so I'll just do a thank you slide real quick. There we go. So I should thank specifically the people in my PhD lab. So Tobias Donner, my advisor here with the sunglasses, and then Jan-Willem de G and where is he? Konstantinos Setsos, who I worked with on the modeling paper. These are the folks at Cold Spring Harbor. I didn't have time to talk about mouse neurophysiology, but we can talk about that too. That's what I did as a postdoc for a few years. And people from the International Brain Lab, which may come up in the panel discussion later. And thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much for this very nice talk.